Good evening, kapow, kaboom. Welcome back. Live with Littlewood's back on air. I'm joined, as usual, not just by a stellar lineup of casts this time, but of a series of total galacticos to, in the course of the next 90 minutes, raise the level of debate and to put the world to rights. So welcome back to this first episode of season 2 already of Live with Littlewood, with me, Mark Littlewood, the Director General of the Institute of Economic Affairs, and my God, we've got a lot to get through. We'll be discussing Boris's build strategy and his apparent assertion that he's not a communist at all, but he appears to be a bit of a fan of FDR and the New Deal. We'll be looking a bit at regional lockdowns. Can they possibly work sensibly and accurately? What's going to happen in Leicester? We'll be touching on the ongoing Whitehall reforms following the government's decision to look for a new head of the civil service to replace Mark Sidwell. And we're going to touch on what the heck is going on in the United States of America. We sometimes seem to be in a battle with them about whether this side of the pond is crazier or their side of the pond is crazier. Let me just tell you a little about the guests that we've got coming up later on in this programme. In about 20 minutes' time, we're going to be joined by Kate Andrews, now the economics correspondent of the Spectator, but previously the associate director here at the IEA. I'm going to be asking her thoughts on the National Health Service and how it's come out of this crisis. We're also going to be joined by the IEA's very own Christopher Snowdon. He's the head of lifestyle economics here, a long-term critic of the nanny state and of public health England, and I'm going to be asking him whether Public Health England can really survive its performance over recent months. Coming on after that is Benedict Spence, journalist and commentator. He's going to be covering a whole eclectic range of things I'm going to be asking him about. We also have Dr. Stephen Davies, the IEA's head of education, a regular on the IEA London YouTube channel. And then later on in the show, we'll be joined by Tom Harwood, of the Guido Fawkes website from across the pond in the windy city of Chicago. For the last segment of the show, we're joined by my good friend John Tillman, who's the chairman and the CEO of the Illinois Policy Network, and Ollie Wiseman's back on the show, the US editor and commentator of the Critic. So I promised you a lineup of galacticos. That's what we've got, and we have 90 minutes to put the world to rights. And I'm delighted to welcome my first two guests, Brendan O'Neill, the editor of Spiked Online. Brendan, great to have you with us. Great to have your audio and visual working brilliantly this time. Good evening, Brendan.
Hi, Mark. How's it going?
Perfect. Really good. And my very good friend, Alex Deane, conservative pundit, commentator, regular on Sky News, internet, Twitter warrior, where he brings common sense and goodwill to all men. Alex, how are you, my friend? Good evening.
I'm fine, thank you, Mark. It's great to be back with you.
So, Brendan, I'm going to start with you, and this is a fairly sort of general question, I guess. But with us not having been on air for the past few weeks, so I've been just sort of reading newspapers, watching television, but not commenting on them. I am truly shocked and appalled, disgusted even, about the lamentable state of public discourse in the UK. And I want to put a theory to you, and I want you to tell me whether you agree with me or not. It seems to me that debates of absolute substance seem near impossible in the modern era of public discourse. Everything is about sending a signal, waving a flag, and I'm not saying that these signals and symbols and flags are bad or wicked in any way, but it's very difficult, for me at least, to understand what the argument is about. I haven't yet got my head around what Black Lives Matter stands for, other than the obvious 3 words of its name, what its wider agenda is, or how institutional racism should be tackled, whether it's getting better or worse. Later on in the show, I think we'll have a similar discussion about the debate around healthcare. Am I just an old gammony man going out of my mind, Brendan, or do I have a point here? Is everything just now about symbolism and not about substance?
You have a really, really good point, which is that public debate in this country has completely collapsed. I think it's in a parlous state. I think the problem is that not only do we have virtue signaling on one side, where all you have to do is wear a badge or wave a flag or make the right tweet, and then you're in people's good books. But even worse than that, on the other side, we have this culture of denunciation, public denunciation, almost like Stalinist finger pointing at anyone who dares to deviate from what is considered to be the acceptable, anyone who goes outside of the acceptable parameters of thought or who doesn't go along with the virtue signaling hysteria is instantly denounced as a possible racist or a hateful person or a bad person. So we have this incredibly binary public life where on the one hand, you just very shallowly signal your virtue, advertise your awareness, show what a good person you are with no substance, no reflection, no discussion. Or you're on the other side where you're constantly being denounced as this wicked, evil, bad person because you don't live up to those, pseudo-ethical standards. I think it's terrible. And I think something like Black Lives Matter actually sums this up, because I see Black Lives Matter actually as a barrier to the kind of discussion we need about however much racism remains in our society. I actually think they exaggerate the problem of racism in contemporary British society, but that's maybe another discussion. The thing is that kind of movement where it's all about wearing the t-shirt, wearing the badge, saying the slogan, rather than thinking about how Britain has changed, what amazing gains we've made over the past 40 years in terms of racial equality, and what problems still remain that might need to be addressed. Instead of having those intellectual discussions, we're all supposed to get on our knees, bow down to this new BLM cult, and if you don't, you're cast out of polite society. It is completely antithetical to serious discussion and serious policy.
And Alex, I want to get your thoughts in just a minute. But Brendan, what do you think's led us here? I mean, why, if you and I are in agreement that things are increasingly superficial, but also simultaneously impenetrable, because logical discourse seems to be nearly impossible to engage in, why? I don't think when I was at university in the early 90s, things were like this. You'd actually, I can remember having substantive debates and indeed watching substantive debates on television and radio. What has led us to this parlous state in which everything is symbolism and vacuous sort of positioning rather than matters of substance?
That's the $1 million question. I mean, I think it's intimately bound up with the collapse of left and right. I mean, left-wing politics and right-wing politics were the politics that defined public life for 200 years. They had real meaning, real substance. People genuinely attached themselves to one side or the other. My feeling is that has run its course. It's kind of become exhausted and not much has taken its place. What has taken its place is a pretty shallow performative style of politics, where you have, on the one side, you have left-wingers constantly signaling their virtue. And on the other side, which is, if anything, even more unappetizing, you have right-wingers self-flagellating for the crimes of the past, or just white people in general. One of the most bizarre spectacles of the past few weeks has been the way in which white people have been expected to flagellate in public for the crimes of history, crimes which they had nothing whatsoever to do with. So there's been a long-standing hollowing out of public life. I think it was exacerbated by the political crisis of the past 25 or 30 years, where left and right became more and more meaningless categories. And we've ended up with a political sphere in which everything is a performance, everything is a shallow advertisement of one's inner virtue. And the sooner we recover a substantive intellectual sphere, the better it will be for everyone.
Well, let it never be said of this programme where we bring you real balance. Brendan, you would see your antecedents being on the left. I'm a former employee of the Liberal Democrats, and my good friend Alex is a Conservative pundit, so there's perfect balance right at the start of the show. Alex, what do you make of this? You're here not just to give you your wise words and pearls of wisdom, but to cheer me up. Or are Brendan and I right? Is the state of public debate simply woeful?
Well, I disagree with Brendan about the idea that left and right in this country no longer mean anything. We just had an election, possibly the most important election in my adult lifetime, when the left wanted to nationalise or renationalise basically everything. I mean, it was a seismic election in which the right, the Conservative Party, continued to stand for, on the one hand, capitalism and a free market agenda, and the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn wanted us to nationalise or renationalise everything from our postal services and our energy providers and our water providers and so forth. So no, I don't accept that left and right don't mean anything anymore, but I do accept that public discourse has been significantly eroded, or may I say corroded, in recent times. And this virtue signalling that you're talking about will eat itself, because in the end, nobody will always meet up to the standards that are being set, in part because they constantly change, and these shifting sands, views that were entirely acceptable and mainstream even a few years ago. I mean, extraordinary to suggest to feminists, for example, that J.K. Rowling's views would have, even a few years ago, they would have been absolutely mainstream, and now she's verboten in large parts of what we regard as civilized society. But I do also think that there's going to be a bit of a backlash on this, not because of people like us, to be frank, because our views are predictable, as some people have expressed on Twitter in advance of this show. I think that the backlash is going to come actually from the left, and it may not happen as you want it to. It's going to happen because people like Rebecca Long-Bailey, who are avid champions of this kind of public discourse, wind up being consumed by it. There is a perfectly legitimate set of defences that might have been made for the erstwhile candidate for the leadership of the Labour Party having retweeted an article with a positive endorsement. She might have said, I didn't read the whole thing. Or she might have said, I saw that, but didn't take it the way that you mean it. You think it was to mean. But in this cancel culture, you are either acceptable or unacceptable. The remarkable thing is that the people who espouse these views, and many of them are in our mainstream media, and that's part of my answer to why this has happened, that you are either yes or no. And the answer on Long-Bailey, I'm afraid, from their perspective, was no. And I'm not sure the momentum types of this world are going to accept it. I don't think that it's going to be free market libertarians who are fighters for free speech who are going to win this. It's actually going to be outrage from the left when they see that this system that they have rabidly encouraged actually consumes their own champions.
But Alex, that's interesting, and I do want to touch a bit on the free speech issue around Rebecca Long-Bailey, because although it's just one example, it's quite an intriguing one. But Alex, I'm not sure you have quite cheered me up yet, because the problem is if this sort of censorious virtue signalling attitude just kind of cancels virtually everybody in public life, whether that's Rebecca Long-Bailey one day or somebody on the right side of politics the next, that's just going to sink discourse lower, isn't it? It's going to hardly anybody's going to be able to appear on television to voice an opinion, and she'll just completely bland and say nothing.
No, I actually think it goes the opposite, because when people say in the end, as Lawrence Fawkes did, I've had enough, we're not a racist country, you like it or lump it, there's enough of a wellspring of what we might call the silent majority, or the silent until they get a chance, the ballot box majority, who say, yes, I agree with that. And look, I think that, of course, we should seek better race relations, although I think we've gone about it in pretty much entirely the wrong direction. And I believe in tolerance, and I believe in judging people on the content of their character, not the colour of their skin. But because I think Britain is a largely tolerant country, the virtue signalling cancel culture that you and Brendan have been discussing would write me out, not because of what I've said, but because I'm insufficiently agreeing with them. It's not just that you have to agree so much that you meet the standards of what people are suggesting. And the rhetoric on that is either silence is not allyship on the gentler end, or even silence is violence on the more aggressive end of it. So I'm afraid it's not in my job description to cheer up Mark Littlewood. But let me say something.
It really should be.
I know. Let me say something that may assist in thinking about this a bit more, though. I don't actually think this is a new thing. And I also think that it's not just about speech and politics and discourse. It has real impact on human lives in this country. So an example I would give that I've thought of for some time in this kind of space, where people prefer the rhetoric to reality, would be on something like religious adoption agencies, where the Catholics were placing hundreds of children every year into loving homes. That was the reality. But because the virtue signalling culture that we live in said that it wasn't enough for them to do that, they had also to say that gay adoption was every bit as good as straight adoption, as heterosexual adoption. And because the Catholics didn't believe that, it wouldn't come to say, I'm not Catholic myself, but as the Catholics wouldn't come to say that, the people who mounted that kind of rhetoric preferred to stop Catholic adoption agencies placing children in loving homes, preferring to leave them in care, which every single yardstick, every single indices of childhood and rearing suggests would be worse for them than being in a public home. When you prefer your reality, your rhetoric, to the reality of the lives lived in the way they affect it, there's something wrong with things. And it's not with the people who are standing up and saying, actually, Britain's fine, or a tolerant country, or, you know, why don't we look at the outcome? It's wrong with you, the virtue signaller. Okay.
Brendan, I want to come back to you because I'm keen to tease out some of your recent thoughts about these debates. And Rebecca Long-Bailey, I think, I'm putting words in your mouth, so we'll hear your words, but was a sort of more of a political gotcha moment than a serious concern about what she'd said. I'd also like to tease out from you, and I know this has been debated and discussed endlessly, and hopefully it's not going to be the leading issue of our times, about statues and monuments, and because these are symbols, but it behoves me, I think, to play devil's advocate a bit, you know. So I'm interested in your Rebecca Long-Bailey stance, what you think happened there and what was behind it. But I'm also interested, if you like, to press you on the point of when do you think something can be cancelled legitimately? I mean, I was trying to think of examples in my life. I seem to remember when I was a teenager, I went to Birch's Gardens and the Eagle's Nest in Germany. I mean, any emblems of the Nazi Party or Adolf Hitler have been stripped away, and I would say a good thing too. You know, I can remember cheering when statues of communist leaders were torn down and when the Berlin Wall came down with it. So 2 questions for you. One, tell us a little about what you think was going on with the Rebecca Long-Bailey thing. None of us can get into Keir Starmer's mind, obviously. And secondly, is there ever a time where, if you like, cancellation, removal of statues or emblems does actually serve a significant purpose?
Well, I think on the Rebecca Long-Bailey thing, I think that was a good example of cancel culture. I also think it was driven in large part by internal Labour Party politics. I think this was Keir Starmer, you know, putting his foot down in relation to the Corbynistas, which I don't particularly have a problem with. You know, political parties have to clean their houses up. And if Keir Starmer, who is the democratically elected leader, if he wants to do that in relation to the Corbynistas, that's absolutely fine. But I think the problem with the Rebecca Long-Bailey thing is that it feeds into and probably exacerbates this idea that people can be very swiftly cancelled for Twitter crimes, speech crimes, thought crimes, for, you know, for saying things that are not 100% correct. And I say that as someone who has been incredibly worried about the problem of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, which I think was a profound problem, and Labour has still not fully got to grips with it. But I think given that she was simply retweeting an interview in which many things were said, all of which were complete nonsense, by the way, Maxine Peake is the pinnacle of lovey nonsense as far as I'm concerned. But given that Rebecca Long-Bailey was simply retweeting someone she agrees with in general, I don't think she should have been cancelled for that. So I think the problem is that it probably exacerbates that culture of just wiping people off the slate because they've said something disagreeable. In relation to statues, you know, I hear this quite a lot, that wasn't it good when, you know, statues of Stalin and Lenin were ripped down in Eastern Europe after the kind of revolutions of the late 1980s, early 1990s. I agree. The difference there is that followed a very clear uprising of people against the current system of governance. And it was very clearly a people power movement, a democratic movement. It was people saying, we want to sweep aside this old system which repressed us in the most grotesque way. And we're going to do that by firstly getting rid of the government and then getting rid of the symbols of government. I have no problem with that whatsoever. What I do have a problem with in the UK right now is these largely over-educated sons and daughters of the bourgeoisie who are bored because lockdown has forced them to stay at home making sourdough bread for 3 months, who burst out of their homes and get involved in this mass global virtue signal called Black Lives Matter and tear down statues with no democratic consultation whatsoever, no public discussion, and no consideration for whether they have the right to edit public life to their own political tastes. And if you look at where this is going to end up, maybe, right, Edward Colston is ripped down in Bristol. No one is really going to cry much over Edward Colston. But we now have a situation where the Emancipation Memorial in Washington, D.C., and the copy of it in Boston are probably going to be taken down because they show Abraham Lincoln freeing a kind of bent, grateful slave. Those monuments were paid for by freed slaves. The monument in DC was, the speech at the dedication was given by Frederick Douglass, who in my mind is one of the greatest figures in history, not only because he was a slave turned abolitionist, but because he was a fervent believer in freedom, especially freedom of speech, a genuinely important figure who spoke at the dedication of the Emancipation Memorial in Washington, D.C., and said this is the first time in the history of the American Republic in the 1870s that the colored people, as he referred to them, black people, African Americans, have made their mark on the public square. Mm-hmm. What earthly right do upper middle class Antifa TikTok revolutionaries have to take that statue down? It is completely and utterly grotesque as far as I'm concerned. They are silencing the voices of freed slaves who desperately wanted some form of presence in American public life. So the question is, where does this end? It might have started with Edward Colston, but it won't end there. And so I think that this is a form of hysteria rather than what we saw in Eastern Europe, which was a form of democracy in action.
Alex, are you going to disagree much with that? I mean, you very kindly recently took part in another IEA video on our YouTube channel, Monumental Decision, we punningly called it. And I've got a quote from you there. You say, "We are in the foothills of a culture war. Sides are not about race. It's about who wants to preserve culture and who wants to destroy it." Do you still think those are the way the battle lines are drawn?
I do, and where Brendan ended, that's when I agree with Brendan, because I actually think there was some real feeling in Bristol about the specific statue that got torn down and put into the harbour. I don't just think that was unhappy upper middle class kids or whatever Brendan was saying. I think that there was something genuine in the feeling in Bristol. But I think that unlike in the examples of people emerging from repressive dictatorships in former communist countries, we are able to deal with those genuine sentiments around statues which are frankly, on the margin of things. Let's not pretend that a statue of Edward Colston was a central facet of our democratic system or society. We're able to deal with them peaceably and in peaceable ways. And the people who wanted to change the situation with the Colston statue had tried and failed to have it removed in the past, to which the answer is, you must try again. And sometimes in democracies, you try and you don't get your way. And that means that you have to give it another go, not resort to violence. And that's where I come to agree with Brendan, because my concern is where this thing leads. And the most recent suggestion, you always look at the outliers and you think that's not where the central movement is, and you quickly find that is where the movement goes. The most recent outlying argument I saw was that any representations of Christ as a white person or as a European should be removed from any churches. Now we're looking at a real destruction of art on the scale of the Puritans plus. What we really are in the kind of bonfire of the vanities territory. So my view is that what starts with statues doesn't end with statues. That's when we should oppose this kind of violent disruption wherever we can, and we should refuse to discuss these things with people unless and until they agree to discard violence and kind of direct action as a means to getting the end by which they want to have a discussion with you in the first place. You can have no more meaningful discussion with someone about statuary if they say if they don't get their way, they're going to walk away and tear it down anyway, than you can with a terrorist who says, if I don't get my way at the negotiating table, I'm going to revert to the bullet and the bomb.
Okay, that's really interesting. Now, a number of our viewers and IEA old-timers might think that they've just tuned into the Institute of Cultural Affairs in terms of what we're discussing here. But before I bring in our new guest, because I'm going to segue into a major economic issue where I think this is also a problem, I just wanted to ask each of you whether I might have cracked this statue problem. And you're going to be unsurprised about my free market libertarian solution. And Alex, I'll start with you. Let's privatise it. We can have a public crowd-funded bidding war on whether we retain the statue of Winston Churchill in Parliament Square or whether we replace it with whoever you want, David Beckham, Elton John, the Pointer Sisters, whoever you might have. Isn't the problem here that nothing's tradable? So you get a classic economic problem of you know, all the sort of, you know, it's all about lobbying and protesting. Let's just privatise the lot, right? And then people can pay for whatever culture they wish to retain. What do you say to that, Alex? You're a libertarian.
Yeah, I
like
disagree.
me.
I don't want to repeat the discussion that I had with Steve Davies, whose thesis on this point is that we should remove all public memorials and monuments. I mean, if I could summarise that debate, it was reminding Alex of why he's actually a conservative and why probably I don't get accepted entirely into the libertarian world. Or shouldn't be entirely accepted into the libertarian world. I disagree with that thesis, Mark, and in part I disagree with it. This is how conservative I am. I actually believe there is a cultural canon. I believe that there is a good, a better, and a best, and I believe we learn those things by being taught them rather than self-discovering them. And I think that it left to our devices with a poll like the one you're suggesting, God bless the great British public, we wind up with Boaty McBoatface instead of Churchill. And if we had these discussions in Southampton, I imagine you'd have the skipper of your club memorialised in every statue in the land and everything that might be reminding us there is a good life to which we should aspire and seek to live in greater terms, and cultural achievement and political leadership would come down to make more room for those bread and circuses. So I'm afraid I am that much of a snob. I would not pursue the path you're taking, not because I dislike free market policies, but because I fear the outcomes wouldn't produce the canon that I so cherish. And I think in British life, we've basically got the balance right at the moment. We do put up lots of modern art. We do put up new bits of statuary, but we cherish our living heritage and our living legacy. And I wouldn't want to see that go in a weird bout between the virtue signalling on the one hand and the right on the other saying, well, let's just privatise it.
Okay, so I'm glad I found something to disagree with Alex on. We usually agree on it. But Brendan, where are you on this? Are you with conservative cultural snob Alex Deane or man of the people libertarian Mark Littlewood?
I might be somewhere in the middle. I think I don't think it should be privatized, but I do think there needs to be more mass democratic engagement in discussions about who should be put onto plinths and monuments and who should have statues. You know, the thing I always think when I walk through London, I think it is an absolute disgrace to mankind that there is no statue to Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine, in my mind, is the greatest Briton who ever lived. We know that he is largely the cause of the American Revolution, which is one of the greatest events in modern times. He also was a great inspirer of the French Revolution, which I'm sure some of your listeners will be less keen on, perhaps, than the American Revolution. But, you know, Napoleon said about Thomas Paine that there should be a statue of gold of him in every city in the universe. And there is a statue of gold of Thomas Paine in Paris, celebrating his devotion to freedom of speech and freedom of religion. So I think people like that who get forgotten in British history, who had such a world-changing impact, it's worth encouraging a public discussion about those people. My view is that he should be on the fourth plinth in Trafalgar Square. But more broadly than that, I think there is a genuine public discussion to be had about who we value as a nation and who we should celebrate. The final thing I would say on this is, if you look at someone like Oliver Cromwell, as someone, my parents are Irish and all my ancestors were probably killed by Cromwell. That's life. But, you know, I'm supposed to be offended by the statue of Cromwell. I'm supposed to be one of those people who thinks it should be taken down, but I don't, because the contribution he made to English history is I think, remarkable. He shifted us towards the democratic sphere in which we currently live, with a number of problems and bumps along the way. History is complicated. Historical figures are complicated. And I think we have to appreciate that, because otherwise we would have no one who was born before 1960. So we have to appreciate the complexity of history, the difficulty of history, as we think about who we should memorialize in public life.
Okay, really interesting on the culture stuff. I'm going to segue this into matters of national religion, or at least health policy in the United Kingdom. And I'm going to welcome three more of our guests to the channel. Delighted to be joined by my colleague and friend, Chris Snowdon, Head of Lifestyle Economics here at the IEA. He's been even more pessimistic than I've been about the prospects for freedom in the course of the lockdown. We're going to be seeing whether we've cheered him up a little bit. Also, great pleasure to be joined by Kate Andrews, economic correspondent at the Spectator, and formerly, of course, the associate director here at the IEA, and someone who has made trying to bring about an intelligent argument about the National Health Service her life's mission to date. Good evening, Kate. Wonderful to have you with us. And Benedict Spence, political journalist and commentator. I'm going to be asking Benedict about a whole range of things about reform. It also says here that you're regrettably a Liverpool fan. I don't know how you got through the screening process, Benedict, of actually appearing on this show, but it's fantastic to have you with us as well. Kate, I'm going to start with you because I hope you've heard some of our discussion about the sort of ridiculous state of public debate that we've had around symbols and statues and who says what and who retweets what. But you've written at length about the reform of the National Health Service, saying it's not the envy of the world. International comparisons with other healthcare systems show that the NHS performs badly. Just this week, we saw some numbers out that suggested, I mean, early doors, the jury's not in, that the excess death toll in the United Kingdom during the peak of the virus compares very badly with other OECD countries, particularly with Germany. Do you think that we are, Kate, in a position in which rational and intelligent discussion about healthcare policy and what we might learn from the rest of the world has simply become impossible because it's all just about wearing your NHS lapel badge and flying a flag? Is that how bad public discourse has got in healthcare?
Yes, definitely. It's been like that for a long time, though. And I think the COVID effect will be interesting. I'm still pretty pessimistic that we're going to see any kind of meaningful change. If we were to, it wouldn't be coming from the top down because this Conservative government is doubling down on its efforts to fund an unreformed NHS with more money. It was actually quite remarkable in the Prime Minister's speech this week. He basically highlighted the problems with a single payer rationing style system that he said himself, millions of people can't get access to treatment, as if that just happens out of thin air, as if there aren't decisions that are made to create and sustain the system we have. But they're not making changes to it. It would have to be a grassroots move. And I'm not at all convinced that this crisis is going to really lead to substantial reform, but there are few areas to be optimistic. The first is that you can no longer say that if you criticize the NHS, you are automatically endorsing the USA. The COVID crisis has put on the map all other kinds of healthcare systems from different countries who fared far better than the UK. You can no longer pretend that Germany and countries in Asia don't exist. They really do, and they did better than the UK did, and arguably than the US did. Something that isn't really meant to be optimistic, but I just think is a very sad fact, is that the rationing system and the lack of capacity in the NHS, which is necessary actually to run a single payer system, is the worst kind of healthcare system you can have in a pandemic, because they had to kick elderly patients out of hospital and put them into care homes to create capacity. They had to stop very serious cancer treatments. A&E levels dropped, not just because people weren't out and about, but because people were scared to go to hospital. And the government messaging was that you should really try to stay away as much as possible. That was the effect anyway. And we're going to be living with the consequences of that for many, many years to come. And it's going to be tragic, but I do wonder if people will start to think, is it true that in every other system you couldn't be treated for healthcare if there was a global pandemic? You couldn't be treated for cancer, you couldn't be treated for the rest of it. So maybe we'll talk about it more, and maybe we'll have a more honest conversation. Mark, I'm quite pessimistic that in the next 5, even 10 years, you're going to see substantial reform.
Well, I've got something you can be optimistic about, Kate, that I've just seen in the YouTube chat. There's already the beginnings of a crowdfunding effort to erect a Kate Andrews statue. I'm not sure. I dread to think about the level of security that would be necessary to protect that against sworn enemies. Benedict, let me come to you. Welcome to the show. Great to see you. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. We'll make sure that you get away in good time to see Manchester City beat Liverpool later on this evening. But congratulations on winning the league. But I almost consider that football chit-chat is now more deep and meaningful than most political chit-chat, with the singular exception of this particular show, of course. What's your take, Benedict, on the nature of public debate at the moment? Are we incapable of engaging in meaningful and substantial debate about the real issues rather than just flag waving and symbol pointing?
Broadly, yes. I think it's very sad to say, but I think ultimately the National Health Service is a reflection of the nation more broadly. It is very much sort of stuck in the past. It's sticking to its guns about how it is that it wants to be, it wants to be run. And there's sort of this idea that if we could just achieve this little thing of just getting a little bit more money, and nobody's ever quite sure how much money, nobody's ever sure, how much more is needed. But if we could only just do that, everything would be absolutely fine. And you're right to highlight that actually that there is just a complete lack of rational discussion on this, because Kate's right. Ultimately, in a situation like this, a pandemic of this scale, this ought to be the most opportune moment to sort of take a step back and go, okay, well, why is it that the UK has such a significantly higher death toll than other countries? Maybe it's not entirely to do with X, Y, Z. Maybe it is the system itself. One would call that, I suppose, a beneficial crisis, an opportunity to exploit that crisis to actually undertake some much needed housekeeping. But actually, we're going to face a few more of those crises over the next coming years, almost as a knock-on result of the pandemic. I mean, as again, Kate alluded to, we've had a lot of cases of missed cancer treatments, mental health issues are probably going to go through the roof. You're going to have all sorts of knock-on consequences, which means you're going to have ever more opportunity to discuss whether or not the health service is fit for purpose. But ultimately, is anybody particularly confident that we're going to have a discussion anything other than, oh, it just needs more money? Where's the money going to come from? Well, you're just going to have to find it through taxes. And that always just seems to be the standard response in this country, and nothing ever changes. But actually, if you expand it sort of more broadly to most other areas of the UK, there just seems to be this attitude that if you just keep doing what you were doing before, but just on a slightly bigger scale, the blockages in the system will be sort of pushed out of the way, and everything will resolve itself. And it's a sort of I suppose it's a sort of a strange British isolationism, exceptionalism, perhaps not isolationism. There's a belief that actually our fundamentally our systems, our institutions, because they worked in the past, they have to work now. It's obviously just a temporary hitch, or perhaps it's just a problem of the politicians rather than the people actually running the system. But it's almost, there's an explanation for why it's wrong. And even though every time there's a different explanation, the solution is always the same, even though we keep doing the same thing and nothing ever changes.
Right. Well, it's going to come. I'm going to bring Chris Snowdon in now, because it's going to come as a great surprise to Chris Snowdon. Because although I said it's part of Alex Deane's duty on planet Earth to cheer me up, it's usually Chris Snowdon's duty to be an even more miserable sod than I am about the prevailing state of affairs. But on this occasion, Chris, good evening. I'm hoping not, because I want to ask you about one of your bête noirs, Public Health England. And am I right in saying that, reading through the tea leaves, in this area, the Prime Minister seems to share now many of your long-standing criticisms of Public Health England, and indeed some of your more eviscerating criticisms in recent days and weeks. Do you think that's a pillar of the present health policy establishment that we might see tumble, even if it's not quite a statue that's going to be torn down?
Yes, it's quite possible. And because the Public Health England is not seen as part of the NHS, and indeed is not part of the NHS, there's much less sentimentality around it. It's only been around for 7 years. My criticisms of it in general over those 7 years have been that it's hectoring, it's not really science-based, it wastes a lot of money. The criticisms of this year, of course, are somewhat different. Its main priority, its stated primary objective, is to protect the public from infectious diseases. And on that, it is very clearly and quite spectacularly failed. I think you need to be cautious about using too much hindsight with these things. But insofar as you can judge what Public Health England was supposed to do, it has dropped the ball every single time. Even yesterday with the news out of Leicester, it turned out that Public Health England still weren't sharing the data with local authorities. Unbelievable, really, that it came to July before they started doing that. Local public health directors have been complaining for months and months that they're not getting enough information from Public Health England. They dropped the ball on the contact tracing and stopped doing it in mid-March. Very much dropped the ball on the track and tracing. and the diagnostic testing in particular, as Matt Lesh at the Adam Smith Institute has written about. These things are now well established. And my understanding is that now there is quite a groundswell of support for major reform at Public Health England. I would suggest abolishing it, essentially, and replacing it with a centre for infectious disease control that looks purely at these issues. And that's not just because I don't want it to be doing all the nanny state stuff, although I don't. It's I genuinely think that you can't focus on so many different things. You can't be dealing with reformulating food and vaping and minimum pricing for alcohol and preparing
and trying to stop that soup
monitoring the world
from China or whatever.
Exactly right. Yeah, exactly right. And the World Health Organization faces exactly the same problems. And I was interested to see last week, David Cameron had suggested not abolishing it because he accepts that it's kind of here to stay, but producing or creating another agency that is only looking at monitoring, surveillance of these new kind of tropical disease threats.
Alex, I want to bring you back in, and I want to give you and Brendan some time before we let you go. But Alex, are you optimistic that when we get to, which we're surely going to get to, I don't know what form it's going to take yet, some sort of public inquiry into, a full-blown public inquiry into how the crisis was handled? Obviously, there's going to be a whole load of tedious political point scoring and finger pointing. But do you think we might learn something from it? Do you think out of this ghastly period we've gone through, we might actually, in the course of that, have a sensible discussion about whether we really are sure that the National Health Service is the envy of the world, and the only reason it hasn't been replicated elsewhere is that Johnny Foreigner, whilst green with envy, is also a complete idiot and incapable of replicating our system? Do you think some good could come of this in the public inquiry, or is it just going to be a whole load of tedious point scoring about why Matt Hancock didn't order the right level of PPE for a particular hospital on a particular day?
Both. We will learn something from it, not because I have huge faith in these kinds of inquiries. I think you're right, we're guaranteed to have one. I don't set a great deal of stock in them. I tend to think that a judge-led inquiry is the last refuge of the political scoundrel, but sometimes they are forced upon you and you have to have one. But by the law of averages, if you throw enough darts at the dartboard, in the end, given how much they rake over everything and go through everything, you do get some kernels of knowledge. Whether the juice is worth the squeeze, different discussion, but you will get something from it. But the reason I disagree, I'm afraid, with Kate's optimism about the idea that we're going to see some more world systems discussed in the UK, I'm afraid I think that's an informed and rational perspective, and therefore almost certain to be wrong. I think in the UK she will still, for the rest of her career, as long as Kate's willing to stand up and say the NHS isn't the envy of the world, people will say, oh, you want us to be like the United States then. The truth is that our NHS does some things well and some things badly. Like anything, like any system, and there is room for perfection and there's room for improvement rather than it being perfection. But for as long as we have this strange kind of deity, this strange kind of worship about it, we won't make progress. And just finally on what was being discussed about spending being the be-all and end-all, I trace that really back to 1997, when Gordon Brown, in the engine room of the United 10 and 11 Downing Street operation, made virtue of spending money on the NHS with the aim of being able to say that the money had been spent, not with an eye to better outcomes, but so as to be able to say we have spent more money. But it is a bipartisan point from me, because no other political party has dared deviate from that course ever since.
Brendan, before we let you go, let me have your thoughts on the healthcare debate. Kate Andrews has taken more brickbats than most for, daring to call out the national religion, pointing out that the emperor has no clothes. Any prospect that we might actually have a serious discussion here, compare and contrast ourselves with the Dutch or the Swiss or the Germans, or rather than it just being this endless, tedious, false dichotomy between the system we've presently got and America?
I actually share Kate's optimism on that. I do think there will be more discussion of other health systems. There ought to be. There are very interesting health systems in Europe in particular. So I hope that will be the case, and I think it might be. I share many of Kate's incredibly well-researched criticisms of the NHS. The thing that concerns me, however, going ahead, is that even though I think there are 1,000,001 problems with the NHS, including with how it dealt with the COVID crisis, I hope it doesn't distract from what I consider to be the larger problem, which is hysteria. And I think the thing that has screwed up Britain over the past 100 days, because we're now in 100 days of lockdown, has been hysteria, has been the unanchoring of the political elites from any form of rationalism or reason, and their openness to acting in a deranged, hysterical way in response to any kind of threat. What we did in this country was catastrophic. We locked down healthy young people who could have been working and producing and doing useful things. And we didn't lock down old, vulnerable people who we know for a fact are more susceptible to this illness than anyone else. That's the mistake we made. And the reason we made that mistake is because we rushed into a Chinese-style lockdown situation, largely on the basis of the politics of fear. And also because this country, like many other Western countries, takes a rather disdainful view of elderly people. We see them as a bit of a burden. We see them as racist, problematic, Brexit voters. You know, who cares about them? And as a consequence of those two factors, we ended up in a situation where healthy young people were locked in their homes for months on end, and old people were shoved into care homes even if they were infected. That's the catastrophe, and I think the engine of that catastrophe was partially the NHS and its stupid managers, but also the culture of hysteria and the politics of fear.
Brendan and Alex, just before I let you go, as you may or may not be aware, we have a very important, highly market-sensitive test that we need to ask you about, which is the Live with Littlewood Optimism Barometer. If my rudimentary mathematics are right, I add together everybody's mark out of 10 for how optimistic you are about Britain over the next 2 or 3 years, and that produces a market-moving number at the end of it. So, to both of you, thank you very much for your contributions and for making sure that on this platform, at least, deranged hysteria is truly avoided. But Brendan, what would your number be out of 10? Next 2 or 3 years in terms of rationality and prosperity returning in the United Kingdom?
I would give it 8 out of 10, largely because of Brexit, because the people of this country are sensible and rational and democratic, even if the elites are completely and utterly mental. So I would give it 8 out of 10. I think there's huge prospects for this country if we listen to the right people rather than the wrong people.
Alex, I think I know what number you're going to give me. You're a consistent sort of man, but let's hear it anyway, Alex.
It's a 10 from me. I think we are guaranteed to have a better future. And you asked, the test is, am I optimistic? And I think we are guaranteed to. We know we're not going to extend our transition in this wretched European Union anymore. We know that we're going to have more control over our own future, better in the future. And indeed, looking at other things, the R rate is coming down and our death rate is coming down from this terrible condition too. But most of all, Brendan is right, it's the ability to determine our own future on a macro scale, do deals with third countries and control our own destiny. I feel great about Britain's future.
Gentlemen, Alex, Brendan, thank you very much for joining us. And wow, we're at the moment on an average 9. That's pretty damn impressive. I've got some more guests to join us very shortly, but I do want to come back to our new panellists because I haven't let Chris, Kate and Benedict yet get a bigger slice of the pie. So Alex and Brendan, have a very good night. Thank you for joining us. We'll have you back very soon.
Thanks, guys.
See
you soon.
Cheers.
Kate, I want to come back to you because you're an old intellectual warrior on this issue, and I can call you an old intellectual warrior now because you're now in your 30s. So you're now an old and cynical person, Kate. Yes, your idealistic youth is now behind you.
We'll have words later.
But what I'd like to ask you, if we want to open up this debate about healthcare policy in a kind of sensible and rigorous way, what are the trigger points? Because I can't help myself, but I'm trying to ignore Twitter more than I used to, because the minute you say, actually, the NHS is pretty bad compared to the German system, you just get a pile on of people who assume that I want, poor working class or elderly people to die in order that my American mates can buy the NHS and asset strip it or something. But you have been hugely successful, Kate, in opening up the debate about healthcare. Give us some tips about what are the kind of 2 or 3 points we should make to at least get the prospect of reform onto the agenda.
Well, that's generous, Mark. I'm not sure that's totally true, but I'll take it. Look, I think up until pre-COVID, basically.
I was rude about your age, so I had to be generous.
Yeah, you
about
were.
your
You have to make it up. Pre-COVID, I think most convincing arguments were that the UK did not need to look to the USA, but needed to look to its neighbours. And I also think that the most convincing arguments pre-COVID were actually in the numbers. A lot of the work that Christian Niemitz at the IEA has done, looking at sometimes the tens of thousands of lives that could be saved if people were simply treated in Germany or the Netherlands as opposed to the UK. But I'll tell you what has changed. We're not really after COVID, are we? But what's changed since we've had this pandemic is that you've just had, billions of people all around the world lock themselves in their homes to do so to save the lives of strangers. I think all of us, whether you are really anti-lockdown, pro-lockdown, everybody has a much more vivid and intense sense of life and the importance of it. And it is no longer acceptable. It was never acceptable, but it is really not acceptable now, in my opinion, to listen to the stats on strokes and cancer and heart attacks and diabetes and the rest of it, and to say, oh, you want the American system. No, the other side has to engage on this now, because you cannot say that people who have COVID, their lives matter, but stroke patients and cancer patients don't. And the next time that somebody says you want the US system, I just think we can't really tolerate this anymore. It is time that we talked about all of these ailments and the way that the NHS treats them. And I think there should be more appetite for that now, because if you are a young, healthy person, as Brendan mentioned, and you have gone into lockdown, even though you weren't particularly at risk, you did so to save other people's lives. And I think certainly at the beginning of this, back in March, I personally think that was the right thing to do. Now, more than ever, is the time to talk about all of those ailments and how they affect everyone.
Benedict, let me come back to you. Are you optimistic about institutional reform? You might want to touch on, it's all sort of criminology, but what's happening at the top of the civil service, and whether this government's now going to, streamline Whitehall or find some better way of making decisions at the heart of the government beast. I'm a bit sceptical that you can ever make good and rational decisions at the heart of the government beast. But is institutional reform, Benedict, going to happen? And if it is going to happen, are you a pro-Cummings, Boris kind of guy on this? Is this going to lead us to some radical, meaningful reform?
I mean, I try not to be pro anybody. It makes it very difficult to commentate in a very fair way. But Adam Bolton at Sky seems to have got it into his head that I'm some sort of massive fan of Dominic Cummings. I wouldn't go that far, but I think what he does preach is that there needs to be reform in the system. And I think actually the last few general elections have shown that. I think in a lot of ways, I think this is the problem that a lot of Remainers, the mistake they made about Brexit is that it's not some sort of, entirely about Europe. It's as much about failures in the system, both in Brussels, but also in Westminster, and the way that Westminster often used Brussels to sort of hide behind its own failures. So I think at the very least with somebody like Dominic Cummings, and he's been very clear for anybody who wants to go to find this stuff, he's been very clear what he thinks, the major issue is, and that's that he believes that especially the civil service is a major sort of handbrake on the UK in general. So I think whilst you've got something like that at the top of the tree, it's a lot more likely that you'll get this sort of institutional reform that I think most of us would agree is badly needed. I think that's something we can all agree on both sides of the aisle. Nobody's particularly happy with about the way the country is run. The issue, I suppose, I have is that what comes after that? Right now it's clear that he's taking on the civil service. I'm sure that he can make great inroads into reforming the civil service, but it's interesting that your previous two guests, Brendan and Alex, felt that they said that they were optimistic about the future of the United Kingdom. And I have to be honest, I'm not. Largely because referring back to Mr. Cummings' IPPR address in 2014, I think it was, where it might have been 2016, but he set out his idea for the future of the UK, how it was that the UK would be able to prosper outside of the European Union without going over to the to the United States and becoming its poodle, and without becoming sort of a smaller version of the empire, just appealing to the Commonwealth. His idea was, sort of in this post-imperial age, we would have to become a nation that built itself on its ingenuity, on its industry, but also on its education, becoming sort of a global education system. And I look at the education system in this country, and I think that's a far bigger institutional mess up than the civil services. You only have to look now at what passes for the intelligentsia of this country, for what's happening in all kinds of industries, at the top of these industries, in private companies, the way that people are just kowtowing to the mob on all sorts of culture war issues. Now, when you see that, and you see that it's sort of permeated into all aspects of British life, but also that we are so badly educated on things like history, like philosophy in this country. And then you think about how militant a lot of the teaching establishment is, a lot of the universities are against conservatism and especially against reform. And you think, well, how is one man going to deal with that if he's only got 5 years necessarily to perhaps reform also things like the civil service? That fills me with worry.
Sure. Chris, I'm going to bring you back in shortly, but I want to bring in two additional guests to try and dig under what it is that we think the government's strategy actually is here with Boris Johnson's recent announcements, and whether we approve of it is a separate question to whether we even understand it. So I'm really pleased to welcome back to the show Steve Davies, Dr. Steve Davies, my colleague here at the IEA and our head of education. Steve, it's fantastic to have you with us. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. And also delighted to be joined by Tom Harwood, senior reporter at the Guido Fawkes website, was also one of our guests on the pilot episode of Live with Littlewood. So it's fantastic to have Tom back for season 2, episode 1. You know, we've always got to launch with a bang each season, and Tom's going to help us do that. So good evening, Tom. Good evening, Steve. Lovely to have you with us. Steve, I want to start with you because I'm interested in trying to get into the mind of the Prime Minister and understand his strategy, and it's not a wholly easy thing to do. So on Tuesday of this week, he stood at a podium. The words on the podium was build, 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 and outlined our path out of the present sort of economic ruin. It does seem to be actually quite a lot of what he announced was in the Conservative manifesto in 2019, but he felt it necessary to say that he wasn't a communist. But then he referenced FDR's New Deal. Steve, do you think Boris Johnson's basically a New Deal Democrat? And if he is, should we be worried?
Well, no, I don't think he's that. I don't think I could actually put myself into Boris Johnson's mind. That's rather a tall task, I would think. What I think this shows is that he's thinking very seriously already about how he's going to win the next election. And I think all this talk about a New Deal is basically the way I would unwrap that is to say what it means is, well, we're in a bit of a hole, and I know that if I don't do something that will impress the public, I'm going to lose the next election. So I think I need to roll out something that will make a lot of waves and will give everybody the impression, the idea that I'm doing something, which is actually what Franklin Roosevelt did with the first New Deal, because he actually frankly said that, you know, in this situation we're in, we'll just try anything. Anybody brings any idea, we'll give it a go. And I think that's pretty much the same kind of thing here. And the build bit, I mean, he's got previous in that regard. I mean, when he was mayor of London, he wanted to build an entire artificial island off the coast of Essex. So major infrastructure projects are something he's got a bit of an interest in, I think it's fair to say. But I'm rather cynical about this. I think this is, Dominic Cummings may have more strategic ideas, but I think in the Prime Minister's case, this is more about creating a particular kind of impression for the voters, the impression that something is being done and it's big and dramatic.
Tom, let me come to you for your thoughts. Your day job and night job is to understand what's going through the addled mind of people who work full-time in politics. And I think it's fair to say that you haven't been enormously impressed of late with the government. A quote from you: the government's missteps in dealing with this crisis have come when it rejected market solutions, from rejecting private testing labs to rejecting the Apple-Google API. If we'd followed Germany's market-led approach, we'd be in a better position today. Help us understand what it is that you think the Prime Minister, what course is he trying to chart for us with this sort of New Deal, build stuff? What's it all mean?
Well, I think firstly, with regard to how we were dealing with COVID, we were sailing blind through so much of this, and far too much of our response to the COVID crisis was led by the institutions rather than the politicians. And it's when these sort of quango state was leading the response to the crisis was when we made the biggest errors, whether it was that command and control testing idea that Public Health England was pursuing right at the beginning of this crisis, that actually it's now turned out was overturned by Matt Hancock. So often it's been the politicians that have had to step in and say, whoa, what are these quangos doing, in order to bring us back on track. So I think there are some elements whereby we made bad errors at the start and now we've turned onto a better course. But when we come to the response, I think there's a difference here in terms of the rhetoric and the reality. Yes, it always sounds nice for a glossy press release to say an FDR style response to this crisis, but this isn't a Great Depression style crisis. It's a government imposed crisis, and it isn't a case of bad firms failing. It's a case of good firms, viable firms being shut down by the government. The response has to, of course, be different. But that can, in many ways, justify more government intervention, in my view. However, I think the most interesting thing about the Build, Build, Build speech wasn't about the 5 billion extra spending from the government in relative terms compared to what's been spent over the last 3 months. Pretty much nothing. But it was actually the ideas towards planning reform and unleashing a tidal wave of private investment and doing it quickly, stopping the newt counting. That's going to be the real driver of comeback, and that's going to be the real driver of growth.
And do you think, Tom, he's got that right on planning reform, or is it still too timid, or is it too early to say?
Well, I wish we knew. We haven't had the full details fleshed out. I mean, I know from conversations with people in government that there is a real drive from certain key players there to get this sorted. But of course, there are always innumerable obstacles in the way. And I think what we've seen a lot of the time over the last 6 months of this government is they start out doing something very noble and very good, and they can sometimes succumb to public pressure or interest group pressure. We've seen that to some extent on trade in the last couple of weeks. So I think it's still too early to say to some extent whether they'll follow through with the big visions that they're talking about in private in terms of how to unleash that private investment and get us building, not just from the government, but crucially from the private sector as well.
Chris, I haven't brought you in for a while. Let me bring you back in, because I think it's fair to say, I don't think I'm caricaturing your stance, that you were, I mean, insofar as you're ever optimistic about anything, you were relatively optimistic about Boris Johnson as Prime Minister. What do you make of his new strategy from a free market liberal perspective? Mixed, good, bad? What do you like? What do you like that you're hearing, and what chills you to the bone?
Well, I'm still not sure what the strategy is. I totally agree with Steve. I thought it was like an election stump speech. I thought it was very, very striking. And people like us can say, well, this stuff has been announced before. It was announced before the election. Why is he still going on about it? But we all know really that most people forget or never pay attention in the first place to what's announced in the election. You also got to remember we had 3 elections in 4 years. And each time, every party promised the world. It's only the party that won had to actually stump it up and give us some plans. So I think it's perfectly reasonable, actually, for any prime minister to repeat themselves, if you want to put it like that, and just say, look, we promised all this money. This is what we're doing with it. Here's a few more details. There might not be enough for political anoraks in a 1-hour speech, but it reminds the general public that actually a lot of money has been pledged and it's going to go on X, Y, and Z. In terms of like the general kind of Keynesian, New Deal stuff behind it, I don't know how seriously to take that. New Deal is a good thing. I'm not sure, but I don't think the details are there yet. I can understand from political reasons why he's doing what he's doing, particularly again, Steve says.
Okay.
There's no other good news.
Kate, I think a bit like Chris, you were initially, from a free market liberal perspective, pretty optimistic that the Johnson government could be a very reforming government. But I've got a quote from you here. The vast majority of announcements made this week were not new, but manifesto promises from the 2019 election. You've also suggested the PM's political positioning is moving him away from the market economy towards state intervention. So now you're well into your 30s, Kate. Are you becoming more cynical and sceptical about the initial trajectory of politicians who, at the outset, you admire and place your naive faith in when you were in your 20s?
I was pretty cynical when I was 29 too. Look, I think I was most generous to Boris Johnson's government and cabinet on immigration, and I would stick by that. The immigration system they brought in is by no means what I think a free market liberal would concoct out of thin air, but I think it's decent, and I think it creates a lot of opportunity for people outside of the European Union. I'm going to be a lot less generous, though, to what happened this week. I mean, not only was it old ideas that Boris Johnson tried to repackage as how we recover from potentially the biggest economic contraction in 300 years. The biggest change and shift that we saw in that speech was away from the market, so much so that it got to the point where, as Mark, you said, he had to clarify that he wasn't a communist, not exactly something you'd expect from a conservative government. And for people who are excited about the Whitehall reform, I would encourage you to read my colleague James Forsyth in this week's cover piece for The Spectator. There is going to be massive Whitehall shakeup, but a lot of people in number 10 are hoping that this is going to be to centralize more power. The attitude is, well, we're in charge, we know what we're doing, so we can grow the size of the state. I think a lot of the free market rhetoric that we heard in months previous, it sounded good, but it's very clear that they're not planning on acting on it. I suppose the caveat here is that we haven't actually heard from the Chancellor yet, who is speaking next Wednesday, and we're going to get more specifics. There may be more to praise around planning reform. We may get some more supply side reforms. We don't really know what's coming yet. But if we were to base it on the Prime Minister's speech, I would say not only it wasn't very free market, but frankly, it's quite out of date. If you're going to fix the COVID crisis and the corona economy by dueling the A1, I think you need to think more outside the box. It's not to say you shouldn't create a duel on the A1, but that cannot possibly be what the government thinks it's going to take to fix this economic hibernation that we've been in for months.
Benedict, I didn't want to, corner you into Adam Bolton style on whether you're pro or anti Boris or pro or anti Cummings, but help us understand the landscape here. I mean, how would you characterise this government and its leadership ideologically? What, as Chris was saying, sort of what is the plan? I mean, I'm finding it a very mixed bag, very difficult to discern a particular coherence to it, but maybe I'm just being dense. Help me here.
I think we shouldn't overestimate how committed to the free market the people at the top of number 10 are or have ever been. I mean, it's interesting, at the start of this talk, we were discussing dialogue in this country, or the lack of it. And I think the lack of dialogue goes hand in hand with a lack of trust to other people. And I think actually what you're seeing here, this increased accumulation of power, centralization of power, it completely flies in the face of a lot of what both Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings have talked about in the past. And my only sort of thinking about it can only be because they simply do not trust the people to whom they might otherwise once upon a time have talked about delegating power to actually do what they want or to get the job done. Because ultimately, even though they might pass responsibility onto people, the buck will end up stopping with them. Ultimately, that is always what happens in this country, is that any amount of devolution, we see this all the time with Scotland, which is that everything that the SNP does that's fantastic is accredited to Nicola Sturgeon, and everything that is awful, that's Westminster's fault. Absolutely, it's nothing to do with us. And I think, again, that's broadly, it's a symptom of the state of this country. Now, I think perhaps Mr. Cummings, Mr. Johnson, they're not averse to free market solutions if they think that there's a political win to be made there, or if they actually trust the people below them to do the job. But I think culturally they're far more sort of conservative. They're far more sort of paternalistic about these things. So I don't think we should be entirely surprised that even though they might have started off with these great intentions, at the first sign of a crisis, they absolutely want to get all the control that they can onto themselves simply because they don't trust everybody else. Personally, I think Kate's right. I think that this is going to be a common refrain throughout much of the next few months, is that we all do have a lot of sympathy with Kate Andrews' opinions on these things. But the idea that a little bit of public spending, be it a loosening of planning legislation or whatever it is, on the current scale that the government is talking about, is in any way going to fix this situation, is madness. I think it's sort of reminiscent of the whole idea of a national lockdown, whereas actually, even months ago, lots of people were talking about actually you can't be thinking about something like COVID-19 as a national pandemic. It's localized outbreaks, and you need to think about these things on a local level. But as we see, we've got a government that isn't really all that keen to talk about delegating or localization. Actually, for all it wants to talk about, reforming the central system and reducing its power. Now that it's in power, it's quite keen to get as much of it as it can for itself.
So you don't sound quite as optimistic as our previous guest. Before I let you go, Benedict, and then I'm going to ask Kate and Chris for their views. What's your optimism number out of 10?
It's 3, I'm afraid.
Oh,
I'm
that
but then
average is.
I have been a Liverpool fan for my whole conscious life, so that pessimism perhaps reflects my general worldview and experience.
Well, blimey, if a Liverpool fan's only feeling 3 optimistic after the season you've had, I dread to think what sort of state you'd be in if you'd actually been caught by Manchester City. Kate, are you going to cheer us up, or are you going to dampen us down, or are you going to take a boring, middle-of-the-road view on your optimism?
I'm more optimistic than I was last time I joined Live with Littlewood. I'm actually going to give it a 7. But that's because I think we really are starting to see some signs in the economy that a V-shaped recovery is definitely possible. There was debate for a while, but I would put it down to what the British public will do, almost despite possibly government policy. And again, maybe that's a bit unfair because I know that there is more to come. But I think the way that people are going to react to being let out of lockdown more is going to be relatively positive, regardless of what the government does or even barriers that it potentially puts up.
Chris, I dread to think what's going to happen to the average rating here. Here's a quote from when you were last on this show. Chris said, "People have no idea how bad things are going to get. We could see 4-5 million unemployed. Pub industry dead. Cinemas, restaurants, theatres, it's finished. We're doomed." It's a 2 from me. It's Independence Day on the 4th of July on the other side of the pond, and in practical terms here, can I encourage you to go any higher than a 2, Chris? He's on mute.
The snooker clubs are not. So I'm very irritated about that. I mean, we are still doomed. I mean, there's still 4 or 5 million people unemployed. Absolutely stick with that. It's not, it's not the initial flattening of the curve that's the problem. It's the ongoing problem with social distancing that's going to stop so many businesses going back to normal. And that's why millions of people are going to leave their jobs. And when they leave their jobs, a supply side shock turns into demand side shock, and then you have a spiraling recession. So that's what's going to happen. It's over. Since we last spoke, we've had the whole culture war thing as well, which is even more depressing because it shows us the whole generation have lost their minds, as have the Premier League and various corporations. I'm going to raise it, however, to 3, purely on the basis that they have cut the 2 meter rule to 1 meter, which does make going to the pub just about possible. I'm going to try it on Saturday. I think it's going to be pretty depressing, but I'll give it a go. So it's a 3 from me.
Chris, thank you for joining us and being your usual ray of sunshine. From a 2 to a 3, we're moving in the right direction. Kate, absolute pleasure to have you back on the show. Thanks for all your work and all you do. And Benedict, great to have had you on the show. We'll have you back soon. Thanks to all 3 of you and for contributing to the highly market sensitive Live with Littlewood barometer. Steve and Tom, stay with us because I'm going to want you to stay with us for the last part of the show where we've got 2 new guests joining us to give their take from across the pond. I'm thrilled to be joined by my good friend John Tillman, the chairman and CEO of the Illinois Policy Institute. So John is joining us from the windy city of Chicago. Real pleasure to have you with us, John. I hope that you're coming on screen any second now. And also delighted to be joined by Ollie Wiseman back on the show, the US editor of the Critic magazine. John, I can see you now. Welcome to the program, and Ollie too. This is where I want to start, which is, and John, I'm going to start with you. Your country and mine seem to have been locked for some years now in a battle for which of us can act in the more ridiculous and crazy fashion. Can you give me your spot price today on who's winning that battle? Is it you guys or is it the motherland?
I don't think there's any doubt that we're crushing it and we are winning that battle. You have even no chance to compete. I mean, all of this metastasizing of the cultural war that's going on right now started here. A very legitimate fight for justice, true problems in criminal justice reform. Obviously, the Floyd killing is just a disaster, but that has been largely co-opted by forces that have interests far beyond police brutality and police reform, and are really interested in destroying the essence of the founding, which is the sovereignty of the individual rather than the sovereignty of the state. And that is very much at risk now. And I'm sorry we're exporting it to the rest of the world. I'd like to apologize.
Yeah, so do you think that is it? I mean, is it that craziness starts in America and we catch it 5 or 10 years later? I mean, we often, John, seem to think we're sort of behind you on the curve of, innovation, I don't know, in certain elements of culture as well. Is this an American problem exported around the globe?
No, I certainly didn't mean to imply we had a monopoly in being the genesis of insanity. I think there's plenty of people around the world that have demonstrated capabilities in that area. I'm just saying that in this particular situation, we unfortunately have apparently lost our minds. Dan Henninger of the Wall Street Journal had a great column today about particularly the elites, the opinion leaders, if you will, the people running our large corporations, all the people running the comm shops in those large corporations, they are all caving to intimidation and bullying. The whole idea that silence is violent in and of itself. The idea that I have a right to compel your speech, and that if you are silent, you are somehow expressing violence. These are insane ideas against the very essence of liberty. And I say that as somebody extremely sympathetic who's long fought for racial justice, been very involved in the fight for equality, both in my personal life when I was in my 20s and earlier, as well as now in the organizations I'm involved with. We've been a leader on criminal justice reform. But when we had an internal discussion whether we were going to issue a virtue signaling statement about all of this, I said, no, we will point to the work we've done in the past, and we are not going to raise our hand now in an ostentatious fashion. We'll let our work speak for itself.
Ollie Wiseman, let me come to you. Welcome back onto the show. Great to have you. Ollie, do you share John's pretty bleak take of things here? I mean, from where I'm sitting in the heart of Westminster, things here feel pretty crazy, but I think I have to concede to John that it's even crazier on the other side of the Atlantic. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, firstly, hi to some familiar faces on the call. Good to be back. And I would start by saying, I mean, I broadly agree with that. There's certainly a section of American society, a section of the American elite where things, something somewhere seems to have gone very wrong in terms of how they think about plenty of political issues. I think that I'm a little more optimistic in the sense that, to me, the jury's still out in terms of how we will remember this year and how we will remember the consequences of George Floyd's killing. It's certainly possible that there's a world in which very little changed on, say, criminal justice reform, and we just went down this crazy silence is violence kind of road, and it kind of showed us how bad things had gotten on that front. But it's also possible that something meaningful does come out of it. There is legislative action on police reform. Okay, it's stalling a bit at the moment. And what I'm really interested in is sort of out there in the country, if you'll forgive the kind of oversimplification of kind of real America versus the elites. But there is very interesting polling about a very rapid change in public opinion on these issues, and I would argue change for the positive. And I think there's also quite traditionally quite conservative and sort of less than woke corporations who probably did need to change what they did and who are changing what they did. So I'm thinking about sort of NASCAR, for example, who there won't be Confederate flags at NASCAR racetracks going forwards. And so I think there's kind of two things happening at once. One, I find incredibly depressing, and I think it's just anathema to so much about it's so illiberal, it's so anathema to what makes America, generally speaking, such a great country. And then there's a broader, and I would say, altogether less depressing thing happening, and how those two things, how that sort of battle ends is unclear right now.
Yeah, Tom, Mark, if I could jump, I jump back in on
a quick word, and then I'm going to come back to Tom. Yeah, go ahead, John.
All right, just very quickly, I want to clarify. I'm not pessimistic by any means. In fact, I was just trying to answer your question. I'm actually very optimistic because I agree with what Oliver just said, which is this is a very small percentage of people who radicalized the protest. And overall, I should say the riots and some of the violence that went on, I think the protest overall will be healthy. But I do think that the capitulation to the bullying is also not good. That is the main point I want to correct.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, John. Tom, let me come to you. Your job's to keep your finger on the pulse. I mean, in large part in the Westminster Village. But do you cast an envious journalistic eye over to the United States, thinking how much crazier things are over there, and how you'd have even more material for the Guido Fawkes website if only you were an American in Washington rather than a Brit in relatively less crazy Westminster?
I do not envy it for a second. I can't imagine the kind of tumult that we'd be going through if we had to keep abreast of every tittle-tattle, every second of darting back and forth. I mean, a president who can't bring himself to say the words Black Lives Matter, I think is pretty extraordinary. And I think really Conservatives, actually to some extent on both sides of the Atlantic, have dropped the ball here, because there is a moment, particularly with regard to this protest movement, whereby we can sort of lead on this front. There are real problems to do with the size and the scope of the state and how it interacts with different communities and particularly different races. And there's a really positive small state message to bring here and bring forward. And I'm glad that the Prime Minister in this country is able to say those words, Black Lives Matter. And I was writing just a few weeks ago in the Telegraph that we need to be able to differentiate between that broader movement and a small group of radical Marxists who pretend they lead it. I mean, really, I know lots of people who went on those marches in London, significantly less violent than the ones in America, but still they haven't read the manifesto of some tiny group who pretends to lead this global movement. They aren't calling to defund the police. They aren't calling to tear down Nelson's column. Really, what they know is the truth, that if you are a white person walking down the streets in London, you are not going to be stopped and searched at the same extent than if you're black. And the horrible truth that black and white people use drugs, for example, at the same rate, and yet black people are incarcerated for that crime to a far larger extent than white people. There's a big discussion that should be happening here, that can happen here, and I think Conservatives need to speak up more about it and stop ceding the ground to the radical left on this issue, because it shouldn't be their issue. It should be all of our issues.
Steve, let me come back to you to help us pilot our way through it. For those of you who are regular watchers of the IEA London YouTube channel, you'll know that Steve's written a book which we featured on the YouTube channel. We'll make sure we link to it in the show notes below, and hopefully in the chat as well, on the realignment of British politics. That the old forces weren't really, you couldn't really understand it in the ways that we've had previously as Social Democrats against kind of Conservatives. Everything's shifting around, and that seems to be happening on the other side of the pond as well. But could you help us try and place some of these movements within your sort of new grid, and whether we should warmly welcome them or not? I mean, I think on Black Lives Matter, for example, a lot of people on the traditional right have been very worried that they want to defund the police. I'm trying to work out what the difference is between defunding the police and privatising the police. Yeah. And I'm generally in favour of privatising things. I mean, I'm not sure the IEA generally has been as bold as to say that we should privatise the police force, but, you know, I like their thinking. Are you with me on that? Are there elements of this that are libertarian, or am I expecting an ideological consistency that just isn't there?
Okay, well, I am very much in favour of these arguments for defunding the police, the actual real arguments being made, I should say, not the way they're being misrepresented. I think there's a clear distinction to be made here between, as Tom says, between the bulk of this movement and the original movement, and what is going on amongst the crazy people, if you will, who I would add, by the way, and I don't know if John and Ollie would agree with me, are basically the jeunesse dorée, the spoilt and pampered children of the rich who go to extremely expensive elite colleges and Ivy League schools. And that's where all the craziness is, basically. And the problem really is that the media are drawn almost entirely in terms of their staffing from that milieu, from that kind of educational background. So there's a kind of very close connection between the bonkers stuff that's going on amongst, I think, the increasingly anxiety-prone children of the rich and the media. And this doesn't reflect, actually, what is a genuine, popular protest against a totally dysfunctional criminal justice system. And it's worth saying, policing in the United States spent $115 billion a year. That's more than quite a few countries spend on their entire military. In LA, they spend it's $1.5 billion a year in just the city of Los Angeles.
And that's a very high proportion of their tax revenue, right? It's just on police.
Of their total spending. Now, this is extraordinary, and which are not very good results, it has to be said. And so this idea of defunding the police is actually a call in its more radical forms for privatizing the police, for actually having a residual serious police force, which will deal with the serious crime, which is a small part of what police forces actually do, but handing all the kind of interaction with the public staff over to a quite different kind of organization, much more private, much more localized, much more community-based. And I'm all in favor of that. It also goes along, of course, with things like stopping the war on drugs, getting rid of consensual crime, and also not enforcing things like traffic tickets and speeding fines through the mechanism of a police force. You can have other people to do that kind of stuff. So I'm very sympathetic to that kind of demand. And I think that there's a popular movement which actually has a strong libertarian element. And we should not be distracted too much by the crazy, well, I wouldn't even call them Marxists, crazy postmodernist campus leftists that get so much attention.
John, let me come back to you. Do you share Steve's analysis? And do you think that, although some elements of this cultural movement, seem pretty extraordinary, we were at the top of the show, we were discussing, is everything in public discourse now just about symbols and emblems, not about substance? But do you share Steve's view that there is some sort of libertarian undercurrent here, or at least some Venn diagram in which people of a free market perspective might share some sympathies with this, perhaps not wholly coherent, but nevertheless some elements of it are perhaps things that we should philosophically and ideologically sympathize with? Is that a fair take?
Yeah, that is a fair take. In fact, I agree with all of that, as well as what Tom had to say. I think that there's a big distinction between saying Black Lives Matter, which obviously they do, but that's little b, little l, little m, as opposed to Black Lives Matter, which is an organization that has a political agenda that people may or may not agree with, separate and apart from racial justice. And I think it's important to draw those distinctions and make those statements accordingly. In terms of that point, though, I think what's really interesting is going back to the Occupy Wall Street movement, which I don't know how much of that came across the pond, but you could say that some of these seeds were sown all the way back then. And I had one of the most interesting conversations with a bunch of protesters outside of our office in the Loop of Chicago, a central business district. And there was a commonality, corporate welfare, corporate corruption, the government choosing favors in corporations at the expense of average people, the exploding cost of education, police reform and police abuse, all kinds of the massive injustice of the drug war on minority communities and the poor in general. It's not just that the drug war and sentencing practices in the United States is harmful to minorities. It's also done by economics. If you're an affluent drug user, the courts love you. But if and you won't have to be incarcerated, but if you're a poor drug user, particularly if you happen to be Black or brown, you're going to go to jail and for an extended period of time. All these things have commonality with large swaths of this protest movement, and especially the racial justice issues. But as Dr. Davis pointed out, it has been co-opted by the children of the privileged class, who are really quite extraordinary. If you, I don't know how much of the video you paid attention to, but here in Chicago and Washington, D.C., you had genuine protesters, some of the people on our team included, just overrun by the radicalized Antifa folks and others who are the very people Dr. Davis was talking about.
Yeah.
John, that's interesting though, but perhaps I can press you a little more for folk like you and I who run think tanks that, try to bring reason to political debate, but who also unambiguously, both your think tank in Illinois and ours here in London, approach questions from a market-leaning perspective. How do you think we should try and capture this lightning in a bottle? How could we marshal this point of inflection in order for our ideas to be heard, where, rather than these things seemingly having some grains of good in them, but then being overrun by people of a fairly unpleasant mindset in a whole range of ways? What are we in the free market think tank movement doing wrong, or what could we do better to try and kind of surf this wave a bit better?
I think the big challenge we face is that the statist argument, the left, what we would call in the States, the left's argument, is that the world is an unfair place. And these greedy capitalists and corporations and all these people who have these special advantages are treating you unfairly. And every calamity that comes into your life is not your fault, you're a victim. And only the all-powerful centralized government is the fair arbiter to come in and properly allocate resources and opportunity to create justice. That is their argument. And our side is really, really blind to how seductive that argument is. That is really seductive when you lose your job, when you feel like you didn't get the promotion you should have got. But what our antidote to that is freedom. What we're selling is the unleashing of the human spirit, human potential that resides in all of us. And that's going back to a topic you had earlier in your show when I was listening. Our antidote is opportunity. Their antidote is dependence and relying on the government to fix your problems. You submit to that and they create this artificial ceiling on your potential, your hopes and your dreams and your aspirations through opportunity. So that's why when you have really robust economic growth, as we did here, 3.5% unemployment, lowest recorded Black unemployment in history, lowest unemployment in Hispanics in history, the closing of the income gap between Blacks and whites for the first time and rapidly, it was incredible. But it was because there was jobs and opportunity. And so many people who wanted to pursue a dream and harbored that natural human tendency for that dream versus that natural human tendency to fear and insecurity, dreams win. And so we have to promote our ideas of the best way to pursue your dream. And that's why growth policies focused on creating opportunity for individuals and investment by people with funding is the key in my view.
Ollie, let me come back to you. What's your take on it, and how much in your analysis of American politics are we seeing a realignment in America? I mean, is the entire presidential election now going to be kind of divided along these lines rather than more traditional questions of economic management? What sort of impacts is this having, and is this a permanent thing, or might it just sort of rise and dissipate fairly swiftly, and at some point, although I've been waiting years for this, we return to normality?
Well, I think the election is kind of the exception to the rule, actually, because in Joe Biden, you have a candidate who, in my view, extremely sensibly just refuses to take the bait from his own side and refuses to go down the road, the ideological road that sort of most of the people that kind of staff lots of his campaign offices and generally the kind of anti-Trump movement would like him to, and he is clinging on by the skin of his teeth to this kind of more conventional liberal version of race politics in America that Barack Obama, if you look at his speeches, went in for. It's the language of the civil rights movement, and it's a constructive, it's a unifying version of racial politics in America. And we have this weird position where the biggest and sort of most ruthless corporations in the world are considerably more woke than the Democratic Party's presidential candidate, and I think that kind of tells you that there's a sort of if I agree with Steve's kind of broad thesis, it's just happening in a rather messy way in America, and I think one of Biden's considerable advantages in this election is he's sort of resisting the realignment. Now, it may be that this is the last election in which a Democratic candidate could get away with that kind of centrist message, and that depressingly in 4 or 8 years time they have to go down a very different road in terms of how they speak about social and cultural issues. And again, to my earlier point, I think the sort of jury's still out on that one.
Tom, I want to come to you, and I'm going to put this to all of our panelists and ask their thoughts. In terms of, we discussed some of the Black Lives Matter movement and others, could people of a free market leaning persuasion find friends? But also, I want to ask, which Ollie's point touched on there, Tom, where are our enemies? And as Ollie was saying, it does now seem to be that major corporations are hardly the friends of free market capitalism, indeed exactly the opposite, and not really particularly consistent about their wider view of culture. I mean, the classic example on this, I encourage you to look it up if on the internet if you're minded to, is the Disney Corporation. Came out Black Lives Matter, all of the sort of highly predictable. I can't quote verbatim, but exactly what they would have said. We all stand together, blah blah blah. No racism, no discrimination will never happen. And all of the right terminology used. I'd invite people who are sceptical about that to compare the movie poster for a recent Disney Star Wars movie in America with the poster that was released by them, their decision, in China. A black character appears as one of the major characters in the Western poster. But when they released the movie in China, they chose to relegate this character to bit status and to make Harrison Ford and Carrie Fisher and the white characters rather larger. So they don't even seem to practice what they preach. It seems to be issuing the right sort of cuddly words. Do you think, Tom, that those of us of a libertarian-leaning free market bent need to start to sort of realise that corporations and big companies are part of the enemy, not part of a benign capitalist infrastructure?
Absolutely, I quite agree. And I think that actually for the last 10 years or 12 years, really, since the financial crisis, I think there's been a large strain of libertarian thought that has been saying that, hang on, the corporate world is not the same as the market. Being pro-corporatist isn't the same as being pro-capitalist. And it's interesting that you pick up on Disney, because of course, they're one of the main reasons why copyright law in the United States now stretches something near 60 years after the death of the author of the original thing. That's just one example plucked out of nowhere. But particularly in the European Union, you see an enormous amount of lobbying for high entry barriers for competitors. And it's the big players in the market that aren't pro-market, they're pro themselves, they're profit seeking, of course they are. So yes, we shouldn't see the corporate world and businesses as being natural allies in this. And actually, as people who believe in a smaller state and greater personal responsibility and greater freedom of the individual, we have enemies in every sector now. In terms of the centrist world, you do have those large corporations that want an easy ride for them, that want high barriers to entry, want complicated regulatory structures and large compliance departments. On the far left, you have potentially a more energized, radical, bold left wing than we have seen in many, many years that wants to nationalize everyone's grandmothers. And then on the right, you also see a nativist strain that's been promulgated from America particularly, that is now speaking in a sort of Bannonist way, that's saying that actually we don't really care about the markets. It's almost talking about decadent capitalism and talking more about the idea of preserving Sunday trading laws than anything else as being the pinnacle of what we should do on the right. And so there is, of course, these large enemies that come everywhere. But for the moment, we do have, I think, some shining lights that are batting those away. Of course, Boris Johnson is always presented by the left wing and by the media a lot as someone who's in the mold of Bolsonaro or Viktor Orban or Donald Trump. I think he's totally the opposite. I think in his heart and in the heart of a lot of people in number 10, there is that almost libertarian strain there. Yes, it's not the most driving force, but it's definitely there. And I don't think we'd ever sink down there. And equally, there is somehow the Democrat Party in the United States is clinging on to that blue dog, to that moderate tendency. In a way, I think that someone on the right could be comfortable with voting for Joe Biden in a way they couldn't be comfortable for voting for another nominee of the Democrat Party. So yes, there are enormous challenges, and they're not limited to one side of the political spectrum. If you're in favor of liberty on any side of the Atlantic, you need to be able to watch from both left, right, center, up, down, everywhere. There are enemies everywhere, but there are also allies everywhere. And it's important to reach out to allies who might not necessarily ordinarily be your first people to reach out to.
Steve, let me come as the kind of tactical or strategic point for you, I guess, Steve. Where should we seek out allies? Where should we be looking to find common ground? And again, a bit to your analysis of the realignment of political forces. I think I'm probably still a kid of the 70s. I'm still slightly stuck in this mindset that sort of somehow or other the battle's the capitalists against the workers, and it just ain't that way anymore, right? I mean, actually, corporate donations to the IEA are a tiny proportion of our overall income compared to what they would have been in the 1960s or 70s. We're way too radical for most companies to consider being associated with us on a good number of issues. So, Steve, what's your advice to me about where I should find allies who can articulate the free market liberal case, be good advocates of it, and write me big fat checks?
Well, I think it's personally, first of all, with what you might call wider civil society, but also with the kind of individual entrepreneurs or business figures who are not part of the corporate world that Tom, I think, very accurately described, and are not trying to be part of it. And I would say, apropos that, John was saying that a lot of corporations are just giving in. I don't think they're giving in. This is basically a very cheap thing for them. If they did something that hurt their bottom line significantly, that would be giving in. What they're doing simply, as you implied with your comments about Disney, is doing something that's all pro for marketing with the audience that they want to appeal to, which is the elite. That's what they're bothered about. They want to keep the elite on their side. Now, I think that what you have to realize, and what all of us have to realize in the free market movement, is that we are the radicals, basically. We're the ones who really should be putting up a challenge to vested interests of all kinds. And there are many, many of them, everything from public sector unions in the United States, who are like the policing union, for example, which is blocking all the reforms at the moment, to large corporations which are trying to rig the system in their favor and use various kinds of laws, several which I don't approve of, such as intellectual property laws, to make sure that they get all the rents. Now, as a question of who you get the checks from, well, I think the answer is the people who are trying to pursue the opportunities that John Tillman was talking about, who are finding themselves cut out because they're not part of the political gravy train. That's basically the kind of people to go for. As I say, it's an insurgent message that needs to be put forward. And Tom is completely correct. I agree completely with what he said. We have hostile forces on all sides at the moment. There's the radical left, although I actually think their power and position is greatly overstated, but there's also this threat from the corporatist right and the sort of nationalist right, which is growing on both sides of the Atlantic at the moment and in Europe. So it's time to actually be very upfront about what it means to be a free market liberal, which is somebody that believes in individual liberty, individual opportunity, voluntary cooperation, and not trying in various ways to suck up to political power, or even worse, to capture it and use it for your own private benefit.
Before we wrap up, I want to hear from our analysts across the pond. You might have picked up that as your final thing, I'm going to ask you for an optimism score. But John, I want to come back to you on where you think we can find allies. Do you think there might be a new breed of a kind of Wild West-ish, liberal entrepreneurs who want to shake up the system? Are those is that the sort of cohort that organisations like yours and mine should be, riding shotgun with? Who should we be trying to pull together?
From a funding point of view, I think entrepreneurs who've made their bones independent of the corporate world are the absolute best funders of our kind of work. I have found chief executives of large public corporations are very reluctant to put money into something. They're always concerned with the optics. And to reinforce Tom's point, in the U.S., the companies, Fortune 1000 companies, give 50 cents and 50 cents. It's 50-50. They give to the left and right. All they care about is tax code and regulatory favoritism to protect their interests. But I think the more important answer to that question, Mark, is where we all need to be focused in terms of our policy work and who we're trying to help. And it goes back to some things I've talked about before, and where the opportunity on the right, what the U.S. we would call the right is. I think we need to make a concerted, sustained effort in outreach to minority communities in particular, who have been absolutely robbed blind, taken for granted, and abused by the left's political philosophy and policy results. I think there's tremendous opportunity there. And we're working on it. I've been working on this for a number of years. So I think the African American community, the Latino community here in the U.S. would be really instrumental in that. And then I think another category would be, frankly, what would be once called blue collar workers who've been completely disaffected by globalization. I think that those are really good opportunities for us to make the argument that free enterprise and the founding principles of this country that were actually adopted on July 2nd and then publicized on July 4th are the greatest way to improve the human condition. I think it's the greatest force for good ever created in the human sphere, and we've really lost sight of how to sell it to those people who are being robbed blind and really cheated by the system as it currently operates.
Okay, I'm going to wrap up. I'll come to our other guests, and then John, I'm going to give you the final word. Ollie, let me go to you for your last words. Firstly, what's your? I've got several questions for you. What's your view on whether those of the broad sort of free market stance can make the smashing of vested interest a rallying cry, and to really show our radical credentials rather than perhaps our small c conservative credentials. Do you think that's the right strategy for groups like the IEA to pursue? Secondly, who's going to win the American presidential election? And thirdly, what's your optimism rating out of 10 for the next 2 or 3 years? And I appreciate that those 3 answers may be interrelated in some way or other.
You have kind of carpet bombed me with questions, but so I think on the first one, I think there's plenty of opportunities. I mean, I would agree with everything John just said about blue collar workers, minority voters, and so on. I actually even think like the people you would think were sort of lost causes, that is, let's say, a sort of metropolitan, a sort of members of that, you know, self-identifying members of that liberal elite. I still even think there's plenty of grounds for it. You know, I was talking to someone about this the other day, and imagine a voter who's, let's say, he lived in an event, someone who lives in Brooklyn. He's always voted Democrat. He's in his late 40s. Early 40s. He has some young children at school, and you know, he starts to connect the dots between the police unions and police brutality, between the kind of insane wokery at his kid's school that says you can't have tests because they're racist, and starts to wonder if all this hasn't gone a bit too far. And you know, even there, I see no reason why there isn't the kind of right kind of Republican, sort of metropolitan republicanism that couldn't appeal to someone like that. So on that front, I think there's sort of opportunities everywhere, really. On the election, I think, you know, who am I to especially given that I've been cooped up and not out reporting, which is what I like doing, but who am I to say anything other than that the polls look extremely bad for President Trump? And I think that, you know, it would be quite the comeback for him to win from here. And so I'm sort of pleased to say I think it looks like he'll lose in November, but you know, we still obviously have plenty of time to go. And yes, you're right that my optimism score is kind of relates to that, and I guess also a sort of sense of the sort of limitations of the power of the kind of like sillier aspects of the current moment. So I would give myself a healthy 7, or let's make it 8. Why not? 8. I'll go for 8.
Good man. Steve, your thoughts? I'd be interested if you've got a prediction on the US presidential election, watching from this side, but also your optimism rating for the next 2 or 3 years and why.
Well, I was pretty sure until this pandemic that Trump was going to get re-elected in November. I still think it's going to be a lot tighter than the polls indicate at the moment, but I do think that his administration and the way he's comported himself has been so catastrophic that I think he probably will lose now, which is a cause for optimism in my view. I think that my optimism actually, I'm going to have to say that for the next 2 years, it's about a 6. If you ask me about the next 3 to 4 years, it would be 8. But I think the next couple of years are going to be quite, combative, shall we say.
Blimey, I'm going to need some algorithm to work out that number. What are we going to call that a 7?
I'll come down and say, since I'm not allowed to do a 0.5, I'll say 6.
6, okay. Tom, your views, have you got a prediction for whether the current president will be re-elected or not, and what's your optimism number?
Yeah, I think he'll lose, and I think that will be a very good thing, not in the short term, but particularly for the Republican Party, which needs a shot in the arm. It needs to realize that chasing down this sort of Trump coalition is not a formula for long-term success. So a moderate Democrat, hopefully sweeping the board, would, yes, cause some problems. I'm really interested in NASA policy, for example, and I think it would probably stunt the growth of the commercial crew programs and all that sort of stuff, and bringing in the market to space, which I'm really interested in. So there will be obviously downsides to a Democratic presidency, but particularly the upside will be changing the Republican Party, and hopefully people having that honest discussion with themselves as to why they went wrong with Trump and what could be better in the future. So off the basis of that in America, and off the basis of, let's not forget that the right tends to do better in the UK during election time. Outside of election time, the cultural institutions dominate and the left gets all the airtime. But when it comes back to the ballot box, time and time again, the right seems to win, and they seem to be quite good at this. And this is what this number 10 seems to be quite focused on. So for those 2 reasons, I'm going to whack up my rating. I was going to say 8.5. We're not allowed 0.5, so I'm going to go for a 9.
Oof.
Can't have 0.5s. My maths don't stretch to it. I've already got to do multiple division by 9. It's a goddamn nightmare. John, your thoughts on who the president will be and your optimism rating to wrap us up for this evening.
Unemployment here just dropped 11.1%, 4.7 million new jobs in June. I'm very excited about that, and I think that's a very good indicator that within reason we have a recovery underway. I think Trump is going to win. I'll be the outlier, and I think that this entire discussion is a good illustration of why. Everything that we've talked about in terms of what's going on in the country and in the media and the narrative is really very much an elite East Coast, West Coast dynamic. What is going on in the balance of the United States in the heartland, the Southwest, the Southeast, mountain country, totally different experiences, totally different perceptions of all of this. And we do have an electoral college. Not only do I think he'll win, I think we get a larger percentage of the Black and Hispanic vote than he did last time. He did better with Romney than both. Did better than Romney with single women. He did better than Romney with millennials. And I think he'll actually improve on all of those numbers and stun the world. And therefore, as much as I see the flaws that people want to talk about, I think a sweep by Joe Biden, the Democrats, would be disaster for the country. So it's a binary choice, and I'm a 9.
A 9 overall. I'm going to have to now do a bit of overall mathematical division of dividing the total number. But I think we're going to come out pretty... Actually, this is fantastic, I think, isn't it? What's 63 divided by 9?
7.
7, bang on, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
No decimal points. Thank God I didn't give you people the right to put in 0.5s. That would have been complete insanity. But listen, to all of you, especially our guests from across the pond, thank you so much for joining us for episode 1, season 2 of Live with Littlewood. Always good to see you. Stay fit, stay healthy. Don't inject yourself with Dettol in order to achieve that. But John Tillman, Ollie Wiseman, great pleasure to have you with us. I look forward to welcoming you back again soon. Tom, thank you very much for joining us again. It's been a pleasure to have you on the show. Steve, always a pleasure to have you here on IA London. Also, my great thanks to Brendan O'Neill, Alex Deane, Benedict, Spence, Chris Snowdon, Kate Andrews from earlier in the show. Thanks to all of you who've been watching us. Remember to subscribe, hit the notification bell, go to our website, iea.org.uk, where you can donate and sign up to our daily newsletter. Stay safe, stay free. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Over and out.